All right, cool. I'm very psyched to be here. Thank you so much for all coming out here. Tonight, we're going to talk about building your team's operating system like a product. The most important thing to take away from today, if you can only take away one thing, that thing is that your team's operating system is the single most important product that you'll ever build. And it's also going to be the only one that you'll actually build directly. So we'll go a little bit into what that means. But first, why so meta, I hear you ask. And I would say the first reason why this talk is really important is that it's going to help you navigate the scary existential question that you'll face every day in your life as a PM, which is, what does a PM actually do? And it comes up very often. The other reason is, it's something that I personally wish I'd known as a self-taught PM. I came into product management pretty much by accident, and if somebody had told me this before, I would have done things very differently. Third, it's going to be super helpful for you to hit the ground running in your first, second, or really any new PM role. And finally, it's really easy to forget how important this is, and it's pretty crucial to get this part right. We're going to start with a little bit of theory, which is your team as a product. So before you dive in, who's come across this quote before? PMs are the CEO of the product. Yeah, comes up quite a bit. What do you make of it? Any reactions?
Not true.
Not true? Who said not true? Why not?
You don't have to operate as a CEO.
You don't have to operate as a CEO. Okay, PMs are like X. Center of everything, that's nice. I wish. I'll share one of my favorite ones. One of my favorite ones is that PMs are like orchestra conductors. You may have heard this one before. You wonder, the ones that haven't heard it, what do you mean? Like orchestra conductors, what does that mean? Well, on the one hand, they govern how the orchestra operates. So they set rehearsals, they do auditions, etc. They also make sure that everyone knows what they're playing. Finally, they make sure that everything sounds good together and the tempo aligns. But most importantly, they don't make a single sound. That's pretty important. So really, orchestra conductors as enablers of a group of people trying to make music is, I think, an analogy that really works for a PM. Except for one thing, that as a PM, team enablement is actually much, much harder than it is for an orchestra conductor, in my very selfish view. Let's see why. So first of all, product teams actually have to kind of write the music as they go along. It's not always clear what you're playing, and it's kind of something that you have to figure out as you go along. The other thing is that there aren't as many standard rules. So in the orchestra, you have the nice seating arrangements. Everyone knows more or less what instrument they're playing. You know the right number of violinists and ratio to drummers. That isn't always the case in product teams. They can be very different. And then you're rehearsing and performing at the same time. So every mistake can actually be pretty important, especially in a small startup company. I would say the other thing is you probably don't have violinists waking up one day saying they want to join a startup string quartet, but that's something you'll probably also face as a PM. So you need to build an operating system. And as a PM, you won't actually build end user features, but you're actually the designer, engineer, and customer support rep of the operating system that enables your team. Now, why is that important? It's important because your operating system determines a few things. First of all, it determines your leverage. So as a PM, the size of team that you'll be able to work with and the amount of impact you'll be able to create for users through your team is a direct function of how you can scale yourself. And your operating system is a really important way to do that. Secondly, the amount and quality of your team's output is going to depend a lot on how they operate together as a team. And third, how much your team actually improves over time is also a function of how they work together. It's not automatic that just by working together, everything's going to get better. So going back to the takeaway, if you can only take away one thing, is that this operating system is the single most important product you'll build, and also the only one you'll build directly. So how do you go about building teams as a product? I think the very short answer to that is take everything you've learned about building product and apply it to your team. So I hope you like the Avengers. What's your vision for the team's operating system? Well, how about to enable your team to optimally fulfill your product's mission? How do you do it? What is your minimum viable product? What is the thing that every PM or operating system has to fulfill? I think if we try to boil it down, you can boil it down to two things high level. The first one is you need to create clarity. So everyone on the team needs to know what they're building and why. The second thing is creating velocity. So you have to make sure that your team is shipping and learning and maximizing impact versus the cost, because otherwise the team is stuck. So how do you create clarity and velocity for your team? Again, I would try to group it along three key sets of features. The first one is, what is the flow of information? So across all the different members of your team, how does information travel? And a few of the features that you can create are meetings. So for example, stand-ups or broader team meetings. The second thing is documentation. When do you have to have something in writing versus when is it okay to communicate verbally? Third, specs. How do I know as an engineer exactly what I'm supposed to build, and how do I know I did it right? And then finally, there are people outside of your team that need to know what's going on. So how do you structure updates to people outside of your team? These are all features of your operating system. Second thing is decision-making framework. How does your team make decisions, and who's involved in it and how? So some aspects in which your team has to make decisions are, for example, road mapping. Like, what does our roadmap look like for the quarter? Prioritization. Out of all the things we could be doing, how do we decide what we're actually going to do? And what is the rationale behind it? Finally, when you have an experiment out, do we launch it? Do we not launch it? This metric looks really good. This other metric looks terrible. How do we make a decision? And who makes that call? How much do you as a PM empower others to make decisions versus always having to make the final decision yourself? Finally, the third thing, system of accountability. So how do you know that you're winning? How do you measure success? What are you even shooting for? Goals and metrics are super important features of your operating system. But also the process by which you get to those goals and metrics. Second, tracking. How do you track against those goals and metrics? How frequently? Where do you track? Who tracks? And who presents back to the goals? And then finally, how do you connect achieving a certain goal with certain rewards? So the oldest trick in the book is to say, yes, we can have a happy hour, and if we hit our weekly metrics, we're going to have oysters. Otherwise, we're just going to have a Coke. Things like that. Oysters for happy hour. Good one. We'll keep that one. So with all this, what's the principle behind it? How do you go about navigating all these different sets of features? So one principle that I like thinking about is maximizing product market team fit. You've probably all heard about product market fit. I think it's important to also make sure that the team is fitting with what you're trying to do. And specifically, I think there are three things that need to sort of fit together. The first thing is, what does the company need? Ideally, there should be a lot of overlap with what the user needs. But one additional thing as you're building your team that you should not forget is, what does your team need? When these three things overlap, that middle nubbin there, that's product market team fit. You want that area to be as big as possible. Now, this is a pretty abstract framework, but it's pretty helpful to think through different things that you could do for your team and see sort of where they match. So let's look at a few examples. These are completely non-exhaustive, but just some ideas to understand the framework. So as we discussed, the intersection of what the company needs and what the user needs, I would say, is product market fit. If you nail exactly the complete overlap there, that's awesome, but what about the team? The other overlap that you could create is the team is really aligned with what the user needs, but it doesn't exactly match what the company needs. So this is like mission fit, like you really want to solve this problem, but the company isn't getting what it needs. Where team and company intersect is things like team culture or career growth or personal development. People can develop, and it's in the interest of the company, it's also in their interest. But if it doesn't further anything that's good for what the user needs, it's going to be completely helpful, not super helpful. What about the places that are not overlapping at all? Well, things that the company needs but no one else needs could be things like things that people call overhead or politics. However, it's also important, and it's something that the company needs, but you want to isolate your team from it as much as possible. So things like reporting, alignment meetings, etc. They're still important, but you might want to minimize those. Similarly, what the user needs, like bells and whistles, that doesn't really align with anything else in the company or the team, is also something that doesn't help you on this journey. Finally, if people want to work on their cool new things and or passion projects, it's also not something that contributes to this everything aligning together. So ideally, you want to try to maximize this area by trying to make sure that you select the team that is most closely aligned with the mission of what your product is trying to build, and that you build your operating system to make sure that anything that is a distraction from complete overlap doesn't distract the team from what they're trying to do. We'll apply this in a minute, so it's still a little abstract, but we'll test drive it a little bit. How do you measure success? Well, just like any other product. Think about a few frameworks that exist. One that works is acquisition. Do people actually want to come and work on your team? Are you acquiring new users of your operating system? Once you acquire the users, activation. Do folks actually use your features? So if you create a meeting structure, do people actually come to meetings? If you have a Jira board to track all of your features, are people actually updating it? Because if they're not, chances are that feature is not actually really useful for your team. Retention. Do folks leave your team after a while, or can they grow on your team and create a path to actually want to be there longer term? And by team and company can be the same thing here, depending on the size of company you're with. And finally, monetization. So in this case, monetizing your team basically means creating user impact by being really effective as a team. And so along these four funnel stages, you can actually see if your team is working effectively. Now, typically, the ones that are most immediate are activation and monetization. Those are the two most immediately visible and the ones that shift more frequently, but all four are pretty important. Now, these are all pretty laggy metrics, in that once you see something move there, it's probably pretty hard to move it back. So there are also many, many things that you can do beforehand. So there are less laggy things that you could do for your product and you could also do for your team. So retrospectives are a pretty cool way of trying to address some of those missing overlaps in the product market team fit diagram. Similarly, you can do regular surveys, just like you do with real users. And user interviews are your weekly one-on-ones with all your team members, or bi-weekly or monthly. Sit them down, ask them what's working, what's not working, and that's it's a really easy user interview in that everyone's already sitting right there. You don't have to go out and recruit them. You don't have to give them like Amazon vouchers or whatever other way you bribe your users with. And anything else that you would use for your product. So if you have some ideas or some ways of measuring the effectiveness of your product outside of this, also totally fine. What does this look like in practice? So I wanted to go through like a little bit of a case study, just as a personal example, to show that the same approach, so what we just discussed together, can actually yield very, very different outcomes of what teams might look and work like. So the case study is from having my own startup to becoming a PM at Airbnb. Two very, very drastically different settings that actually lent themselves to thinking about things this way, although I actually didn't think about it this way from the beginning, which is why the subtitle is Where I Learned This the Hard Way, because I didn't actually do it this way. So let's start from the defunct startup and look a little bit at how things worked over there. So it was a startup in hospitality tech, and it was a marketplace, and it allowed you to buy experiences and amenities as part of your trip. So you could say it sounds pretty familiar. There are a lot of commonalities. But it was actually very, very different than my team is today. So let's look a little bit at the team composition. We had 5 engineers, of which 2 of them were in San Francisco. There were 2 back-end engineers, of which one was a completely new grad, first job out of school. He was actually 19, I learned, but he had a master's from MIT. My co-founder, so very, very different people in San Francisco. Then we have 2 of them in Italy, one senior, one junior, both of them front-end engineers. And then we had a Ukrainian front-end engineer in Thailand. So you can see we're Can you imagine building a team? And then we had a designer who was also an engineer, also in Italy, but in a different place from the other 2. And then a few rotating interns. So you can see where this is going. And my training in product management was this. This is exactly how much I knew about product management when I came in. Luckily, I don't know if you ever looked at this book, but this proved to be a very, very, very good start. So, armed by having read this book, I tried to build up the team, and if I were to look back at it right now with today's lens, this is what I was looking at. So, there were a bunch of team needs that I had to work with, and I would say if I had to describe the team, I would describe them as a distributed team of scrappy executors. So what that means is, the typical message was like, just tell me what to do and I'll build it. I'm really good at writing code, but I don't really want to think about like strategy and all that jazz, just tell me. But do give me a chance to explain why it's hard, because I want to manage expectations, and you're probably going to want too much from me because you're a PM. And so I want a chance to tell you why I can't do certain things. And the Italian guys in particular were like, I don't want to stay up late. I'm not one of those like midnight engineers. However, the Californian team was like, I don't really want to wake up before 9:30 a.m. But I do need to know what the Italian guys are doing, and I need to hand over some of the things before going to bed. And at the same time, we had to be super scrappy, and they were saying, you know, I could write tests, or I could ship 2x the number of features, and you tell me what to do. But by the way, you need to tell me exactly what this thing has to do, because otherwise I'll forget. So this is kind of what the team needed at the time. What did the company need? Well, we had about 12 to 18 months worth of runway, meaning that we didn't have space to make a lot of mistakes. We had a lot of direct roadmap requests from the sales team. We're pretty much in our B2B phase, where a lot of the requirements were coming in from the supply side of the marketplace. And as in many startups, the philosophy at the time was, first you sell, then you design, and then you build. The good news was it was a pretty small company, so we didn't have a lot of overlap, and we had a pretty tight feedback loop. So with a weekly all-hands meeting, everyone knew what was going on, and so that was, we could focus pretty much on building for the user. Now, what did the user need? Well, good question. That's part of what we're trying to find out. So we were on the quest for product market fit, and we were super hypothesis driven. But we were focusing a lot on B2B, so we had a lot of requests coming in from the sales team, and the prioritizing and sizing was actually much more important than looking at 1 million different users and figuring out what you need to build to make all of those 1 million different users happy. So where did we land? If we look at the flow of information, it was pretty formal, because we had to make sure that everyone across the world in all those different places and on all those different time zones had to be informed. So we had pretty regular and standardized meetings on the calendar so that everyone could plan around them. And we had a lot of documentation. Especially the documentation was really technical, because the types of engineers we were working with were used to having pretty detailed specs of what to write. So how we did it is we had daily stand-ups every day at a time that was late enough for the Californians to want to be awake, but early enough for the Italians to still be awake. The Thai person luckily was so flexible that was super helpful. We had a weekly meeting to groom our backlog, so we would literally go through all of the features that were in every week, and we would say, okay, this one has a change in priority, has a change in importance, has a change in urgency, let's do it. We had separately a weekly sprint planning where we would go and review everything that we're doing that week, and make sure that we had the next week planned out. And we had a gigantic Trello sprint board where every little task was logged individually, and it was sized, and it was prioritized, and it was updated every day. It had really detailed acceptance criteria. So there was a lot of very formal information. From a decision-making perspective, as we discussed, the team was pretty much more of an execution-focused team. So they were mostly involved in deciding on the how, and not necessarily on the what we were building. We were pretty short-term focused, so we weren't really doing like 2-year roadmaps or things like that. And we were focusing on just making really fast decisions and being able to iterate quickly if decisions didn't play out well. So we never really had visioning sessions or things like that. We had the occasional brainstorm here and there when we felt like we were getting stuck, but we were actually getting a lot of input from the sales team about that. And then we reprioritized weekly just to make sure that we're focusing on the right things. So quick iterations, fast decisions, the team was pretty much mostly executing. In terms of accountability, we were really just looking at the task and input levels. So everyone had their Trello board. Every Trello card had somebody's face on it, as in this was their accountability, but there were tasks. So as a PM, I was really deeply in the weeds to make sure that every task was getting done individually and on time, and I was also the one doing all the testing. So my way of keeping people accountable was literally going through their features and saying, hey, this is broken. We had very detailed acceptance criteria, and we would literally check them off individually. And as I said, Trello board hygiene was pretty important. How did we do? Well, I think there was one really important part of this diagram that we were missing, and the fact that I'm here working for Airbnb makes you guess which one. Product market fit. We never found it. But I did remain very passionate for hospitality. I did remain very passionate for the space, and so I arrived at Airbnb, and I joined the pricing team. And the focus in 2016 for the pricing team was, first of all, well, handling all the basic rules for setting the price. So the way hosts set a price for their listing and the way that price travels into the guest experience was a key part of the scope. At the same time, we're starting to partner with Airbnb hosts to help them find a price that was going to get them booked to their satisfaction. The year before I joined, the team was very focused on modeling the right price, so figuring out what price was most likely to get a host booked, but they hadn't actually focused a lot on creating a product for hosts out of it. The focus was to carve out an experience-focused team that would take all of this modeling work that had been done the year before and turn it into product features. So I arrived at Airbnb, I looked around a little bit, I kind of got an understanding of how the team was working, and my first impact was shock. And specifically, I was like, where's all the process? We had this like really detailed team, everything like super structured, well organized, like a well-oiled Trello execution machine. And I arrived at Airbnb and a lot of it just wasn't there. So they even called me process man back in my old startup because that's just what I did. So my first instinct was just to say, okay, let's just take that process and apply the whole thing onto Airbnb because that's what I know. And needless to say, that didn't go very well. The first few conversations were pretty clear in that things were actually pretty different. And as I pieced together sort of what I learned over the past few months, I learned that the team was just vastly different, and this whole diagram looked completely different for me. So specifically, I had 6 engineers at the time, mix of seniority, front-end and back-end, but they were all in the same place. I had 2 designers, full-time, luxury. I had a data scientist. I had to look up what a data scientist does because I didn't even know what that was at the time. I had a user researcher dedicated to the team and a content strategist. Like pure bliss. It was amazing. And there was a sister team that was focusing predominantly on the machine learning part. So this was like a completely different setup. And yet I was trying my first instinct was to just replicate the same thing I was doing before. Now, what did the team need? So instead of being with scrappy executors, I was actually with really, really smart, highly specialized problem solvers. So designers would say, I want to understand all the intricacies of how our price tips are calculated. And so explaining machine learning to the design team actually became a really important feature in this operating system. They said, give me a problem. Don't give me a solution. I'll figure out the solution. Whereas my previous team was saying, just tell me what to build. Engineers were like, I don't really need a requirements doc. Just give me the design and I'll figure it out. Very, very different. And they were like, meetings? No thanks. Just let me get on with it. I'll let you know when the experiment is ready. Like, no testing. It's all, like, we'll figure it out for you. And at the same time, they wanted to be really involved when it came to shaping the roadmap. Like, what are we doing in 6 months? What are we doing in a year? And why? How does everything we're doing fit into the company's strategy? Radically different team needs. Company needs were also pretty different. So a lot more coordination, but also a lot more resourcing. So we had a lot more space to experiment. So the accountability cadency was quarterly or even like biannually, because our performance reviews are biannually. The lights were on. There was no need to keep the lights on. In the startup days, the existential question every week was like, can we make payroll in 6 months? At the same time, there were a lot more communication layers. So we had another pricing team that needed to know what we were doing. We had a marketplace team that was the broader team that pricing was a part of. We had all the functional organizations. How do you make sure that content strategy as a whole function in the team is finding out what you're doing? We had the PR team. We had a policy team. We had a communications team. You'd be surprised how much time I spend with the legal team when it comes to pricing. And at the same time, we had customer support, which are, by the way, thousands of people working in 5 different places in the world answering phone calls about pricing tools when they go wrong. So a completely different set of company needs. And also, I would argue, the quality bar was quite a bit higher in a different way. So mistakes are a lot more costly because every time you ship something wrong, millions of people see it within a few days. But at the same time, we had more time to experiment. From a user need perspective, also a very different framework. It was learning by shipping, a lot of research, a lot more data science, a lot more of these aggregating different user themes into requirements of what your feature needs to have. So we had a lot more stable, but highly diverse set of hosts. So we had hosts who had very, very different time commitments and how much they wanted to work on pricing. They had different levels of professionalism. They had different earnings expectations. And so all of a sudden you find yourself aggregating all this different kind of information and trying to make sure that you build something that is relevant for at least a big enough segment of the users. Beforehand, it was just my sales rep saying, hey, to close this deal, we need to build this feature. I was like, okay. At the same time, there was a huge upside because at the time when I joined, our utilization, I can't tell you the exact numbers, but it was pretty low double-digit percentage of occupancy rates. So the upside was huge. And at the same time, there was not a lot of external guidance or existing guidance for host and pricing tools except for those daily price tips. How do we put all of this together into something that creates product market team fit? So where we landed was, you won't be surprised, a very different structure than what we had at the startup. So communication was actually mostly informal, and mostly informal at the team level. The only time when it got a little bit more formal was weekly updates for stakeholders outside of the team and the broader company. So most of the communication was actually done on Slack. We had a weekly team meeting rather than a daily stand-up. The only documentation as a PM that I created for a project was a project one-pager, which just explained what we're doing, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and why it's important. And then the team ran with it. So designers made wireframes, engineers created technical docs, and pretty much the next time we discussed it was at a time when it was relatively clear what we were trying to build. And then we had a team scorecard with all the live projects, but it wasn't like the Trello board where everything was done at the task level. It's just one line item per project, and every week it's red, yellow, or green, and the rest is like detail. Decision making, also drastically different. Very highly participatory road mapping and prioritization. So every 3 months we would all get into a room together, a team of like 15 people, and try to figure out what is our strategy for next quarter? What are all the things that we could build? How do we prioritize them? And ultimately, what's the roadmap? The execution itself was actually primarily driven by functional experts. So I went from not only drawing wireframes, but even like doing some of the designs myself to being very just focused on the strategy part. And so as a PM, I was much more of a strategic facilitator than really the person calling the shots. Which is, by the way, awesome. It's a lot of fun. And so we had quarterly road mapping, and the projects that we picked from the backlogs were actually picked pretty collaborative. It wasn't me saying, like, you go build this thing. And on the accountability side, it was mostly at the project level. So rather than being at the task level, as we said, there was a weekly scorecard saying, hey, team, is the project on weekly price tips red, yellow, or green? That's it. If it's yellow, what can we do to unblock it? It's not like, which part of the task is behind? So I was a lot more hands-off than the day-to-day work, which gave me a lot more time to focus on strategy, but also focus on shaping the narrative of how the pricing product fits into the overall Airbnb product. One small deep dive I want to go into just to illustrate how you can apply this in a slightly more detailed setting. So one of the things that was really hard for this team was we had to increase velocity. So when I joined, the team was used to the modeling cadence, and the modeling cadence was a bunch of machine learning PhDs who were used to doing things in cycles of months, not in cycles of weeks. And yet there was so much low-hanging fruit that all we had to do was just start shipping, start getting out some projects. So we had to ship, learn, and capture impact faster than the modeling part of the team. How do we do it? We had to do it without reinventing the wheel, ideally without too much process, because as we learned, this team didn't love process. And at the same time, we wanted to keep the team empowered. So at the same time, last thing, keeping all the relevant stakeholders informed. So what we did is we had a workshop, and we created the concept of fast-track projects. It was a set of projects that take about 2 weeks end-to-end to build. How we got to 2 weeks is that the engineering team actually designed this 2-week cycle that is managed like a sprint and designed by the team, but we never actually called it a sprint because people hated the word sprint. And it was a separate track of work that the team could join by rotation and could spend a quarter on these fast-track things and then go back and do something else because they didn't only want to do short incremental features. And at the same time, the rest of the team had time to work on longer iteration cycles and bigger swings, so we created a little bit of diversity in what the team could work on. So this was really successful. In 2017, the team contributed to double-digit percentage of Airbnb's annual growth, which was pretty nice. We had some of the highest ratings in internal satisfaction surveys until, unfortunately, in 2018, user needs evolved and started diverging from what the team needed. 1 second, I see you. So I don't know how this is going to end. But what I'm doing right now is actually we're in the process of realigning what it means or what the team needs with actually what the user and what the company needs. And so this framework isn't only helpful when you're joining a new team or starting a new team, it's also important to keep evolving your team to make sure that everything stays aligned. So, last thing, if you take away just one thing from today, it's that your team's operating system is the single most important product you'll build, and also the only one you'll build directly.